Oh hey, I didn't see you there. I was just checking out some really fine wildlife art by our one and only Ned Smith. Wildlife art is actually a pretty cool topic. Wildlife art can be found all around the world, whether we think about places like France and the ancient Lascaux caves, or ancient civilizations like the Greeks, the Minoans, and the Egyptians. But today, we're specifically going to focus on a very brief overview of American wildlife art. Welcome to Ned Talks. A lot of the recorded history of American wildlife art begins at European settlement here in North America, and we can start with the first attempt to colonize North America in John White. John White was the first governor of the Roanoke Island colony in Virginia. Often in this age of exploration, it wasn't uncommon to employ artists and cartographers on expeditions to record the local fauna, draw maps, and help bring back those discoveries from new explorations. White meticulously depicted what life was like here in the Americas, and when brought back to Europe, this was some of the first glimpses of new life in the New World that Europeans were able to see. When he returned to Europe, this was in the late 1500s and early 1600s, so no prints or photography was yet available, so all of the observations John made were meticulously drawn and illustrated when they were brought back. Over the next century and a half, America would continue to be settled by European migrants, and more people were bringing their observations back to Europe. Mark Catesby would arrive in the Americas in 1722 and be another one of those folks that would bring back a lot of depictions of new flora and fauna to Europe. Catesby spent 4 years traveling through the Carolinas and the Bahamas, portraying birds, fish, wildlife, and whatever else he could find. After returning to England in 1726, Catesby published the first scientifically illustrated work on the natural history of the Americas that was known to exist. This even included some of John White's portrayals from over 100 years earlier. And a side note for you, copyright law didn't exist at this time, so it was perfectly acceptable to use another artist's work, especially in John White's case. As we approached the 1700s and the 1800s, America's population was rapidly expanding, including the populations of cities and urban centers. Philadelphia, here in Pennsylvania, actually was one of the homes and epicenters of wildlife art and a training ground for many wildlife artists of the time. Some of those artists you may be familiar with are those like Alexander Wilson and John James Audubon. Alexander Wilson, originally Scottish, would come to the United States to begin studying birds, and he would eventually describe and illustrate dozens of previously unknown species to science. He was known as the father of ornithology. But probably even better known was John James Audubon. Audubon gets much more of the fame when it comes to the field of ornithology, but a lot of that should be directed to his contribution toward the art scene as well. Audubon was the artist that took wildlife art from mere illustration work and documenting new species to books and documents and standalone pieces of fine art. Many of Audubon's pieces were different from the style at the time, and his Birds of America publication was produced with life-size depictions of birds in an accurate setting and accurate backgrounds, which was much different from the bare-bones illustration style previous. A contrast to that would be Wilson's birds, which he often depicted with a bunch of species in one frame together, all kind of crammed together, and it just didn't look as natural or refined as Audubon's work. Audubon's attention to detail was uncommon for the time and really helped to pull some wildlife art into the modern fine art field. Another artist coming in 1850 who would pull wildlife art even further into the professional spotlight would be Arthur Tate. Arthur Tate can be attributed as one of the artists who began to put wildlife on par with the professional scene through his shift from Audubon's style, which was less focused on the subject and more so on the overall scene and the feelings evoked by the art. Tate was famous for creating sporting imagery, which included not only game animals, but also their backgrounds, their habitats, and the landscape. He focused a lot less on the finer details and more so on the broad idea of the painting, the point he was trying to get across. At the time in the 1800s, when America consisted largely of sportsmen, people were traveling west, and people were still much more connected with nature than they are today, this resonated deeply with the American people. A major cornerstone in art history is the invention and use of the lithographic press. In 1852, Arthur Tate struck a deal with Currier and Ives, one of the largest printing firms in the entire country at the time, to begin printing and distributing his artwork as low-cost prints. At the time, only the wealthy were really privy to the professional art scene and able to own that art because of the high upfront cost to purchase original artwork. This ability to mass produce really brought art down in price and was able to put wildlife art specifically into the hands of your average person. When Currier and Ives began mass producing Tate's prints, one could be purchased for as little as a couple of cents. Through the latter half of the 1850s and into the 1900s, we also see a diversification of wildlife art, not just including paintings, but also sculpture and other forms of artwork as well. We also see a lot of growth in the profession of wildlife art as well. A lot more emerging artists and artists that are producing higher and higher quality work. Many of these artists, like Louis Fuertes and Carl Rungus, would be inspirations for artists to come, such as Roger Tory Peterson. At this time, as the artwork was increasing in quality, it was also increasing in detail as well. More attention was being put on the positioning of animals, making sure they were in proper habitat, and really emulating what a natural scene would look like out in the natural environment. As we step into the modern era, wildlife art is bridging out even more and touching Americans' lives every single day. Most notably, we see this with the introduction of the duck stamp in 1934. Wildlife art began to be featured on a conservation stamp that was required to be purchased by any waterfowl hunter in the United States. This got that art out in front of people. The duck stamp is a highly collectible item, something people look forward to every year, and it also raises millions of dollars over its past for conservation of wildlife. So wildlife art is really beginning to merge with wildlife and conservation at this point. Since that time, wildlife art begins appearing on collectible prints, magazines, posters, and books, and wildlife art is going more and more from the professional scene into the hands of everyday people. And this art is also helping to communicate important messages about conservation and about wildlife. One of those books is Roger Tory Peterson's A Field Guide to Birds. This was the first book of its kind featuring very detailed, accurate depictions of birds put together in a handy identification guide that has become the standard for ID guides around the world today. Peterson's illustration work is still today regarded as some of the more famous wildlife art that's around. In the 1960s and 1970s, there was an uptick in wildlife art coinciding with the environmental movement. At this time, Earth Day would begin, and many more Americans were getting outside, watching birds, wanting to do something about the environment, even if it's just getting out to hike or clean up their local stream or river. At this time, people were feeling much more connected to the outdoors, and therefore were gaining more appreciation for artwork and depictions of the natural world. Coming out of this time, many of the modern wildlife artists we see today start to appear. Folks like Andrew Wyeth, Robert Bateman, and of course our very own Ned Smith, who at that time was right in the middle of his career as a professional freelance artist. Ned falls perfectly into that category of emerging artists through the 1900s. Ned was an avid outdoorsman and hunter, and he took his experiences and put that into his artwork. All of his artwork is very high quality, it's very detail oriented, and that's one of the things we really appreciate about Ned and his emergence as a professional artist is his attention to every single thing that went into his artwork. And this is a lot of what we see with those emerging artists at the same time, a big attention to detail. From that era into today, wildlife art is mainly defined by very high quality studio art, art that takes emotion, art that takes natural behaviors, and art that takes natural scenes and puts it into the hands of people. Today, America produces some of the best and most recognizable wildlife art in the world. But of course, there is no possible way we could cover all of the artists, the work, or the contributions to the history of American wildlife art. So get out there, go to a museum, and check out some fine art.
Ned Talks are made possible in part through the generosity of the Thelma and Harold Lenker Foundation.